Martha Ellington was a lonely 62-year-old widow searching for connection. Tyler, her troubled 24-year-old grandson, was looking for a place to escape. When he moved into her quiet farmhouse, no one could have predicted the dark and forbidden bond that would form between them. But what began as comfort spiraled into obsession, until guilt, fear, and twisted love led to a chilling act that would shock their entire community. Martha Ellington had lived a quiet, solitary life in the small town of Brookhaven for over a decade. At 62, she was a retired nurse, known around the neighborhood for her kindness, soft voice, and well-kept garden. After her husband passed away, she never remarried or sought companionship. Her days were slow and predictable, filled with morning tea, crossword puzzles, and occasional visits to the town library. The loneliness lingered in her home like dust in the corners of every room. It was the kind of silence that became normal, the kind that people stopped noticing after years of living with it. That silence was broken the day her grandson, Tyler, arrived. At 24, Tyler had already gone through a string of failures, dropped out of college, fired from multiple jobs, and recently evicted from his apartment in the city. With nowhere else to go, he turned to the one person he thought would still take him in. Martha welcomed him without hesitation. She cooked for him, cleaned up after him, and gave him a bed in the guest room. To her, Tyler was still the boy she used to babysit, the child she remembered bouncing on her knee, not the lost adult he had become. The first few weeks passed quietly. Tyler spent most of his time sleeping in or staring at his phone. Martha didn't ask questions. She was just happy to have someone in the house again. She made his favorite meals, listened to his complaints, and offered gentle encouragement. He noticed how different life in the countryside felt, calmer, slower, and oddly comforting. With each passing day, Tyler grew more dependent on his grandmother's care, and Martha, in turn, became more attached to his presence. The dynamic between them began to shift in small, subtle ways. Tyler would stay up late watching TV with her. He started talking more about his past, his fears, his frustrations. Martha listened patiently, offering advice, but more importantly, attention. As time passed, the way they looked at each other began to change. Martha no longer saw just a grandson. She saw someone who needed her, who made her feel important again. Tyler, lost in his own emotional confusion, began to rely on her not just for shelter but for affection. The emotional closeness between them deepened. What began as shared moments of vulnerability turned into long, lingering silences and unspoken tension. They found themselves sitting closer, touching more often, and exchanging glances that lasted too long. Neither of them spoke about what was happening, but both felt it. Eventually, the unthinkable happened. Their relationship crossed a line that should have never been approached. It wasn't planned. It wasn't spoken. But once it happened, there was no going back. In the stillness of the farmhouse, under the weight of shared loneliness and emotional confusion, they slipped into a secret they could never reveal. What began as a place of refuge for Tyler became the setting of something far darker. Martha, lost in a haze of affection and emotional need, failed to see the consequences of their actions. Tyler, emotionally unstable and untethered, didn't understand the weight of what had begun. Together, they created a bond that wasn't just forbidden, it was dangerous. And while no one else knew yet, the damage had already been done. Life inside Martha Ellington's home took on a new rhythm, one that balanced secrecy and routine with an undercurrent of silent dread. The outside world continued as if nothing had changed, but behind closed doors, something had shifted. Tyler no longer seemed like a guest. He acted like someone who belonged there permanently, moving through the house with a strange confidence. Martha didn't stop him. She cooked his meals, folded his laundry, and sat beside him each evening like nothing was out of the ordinary. But beneath the surface, The quiet tension grew heavier with each passing day. Outside the home, things were not as unnoticed as Martha and Tyler believed. Neighbors started to grow suspicious. It wasn't just that Tyler was staying there, it was how the two of them behaved together. They were seen walking side by side through the neighborhood, closer than most would expect from a grandmother and grandson. At the local grocery store, a clerk whispered to another employee about the way Martha and Tyler exchanged glances. Too soft, too intimate. Whispers began circulating, but no one had the nerve to confront them. Back at home, the relationship became harder to manage. What once felt like an escape was slowly turning into something destructive. Tyler was growing restless. The secrecy, the isolation, the weight of what they had done, it all started to wear him down. He began sleeping through the day and staying up all night. He rarely left the house and avoided phone calls from friends and family. His mood swung unpredictably. One day he would be affectionate, the next cold and withdrawn. Martha tried to comfort him, but it was clear that he was unraveling. Martha, too, began to feel the cracks forming. She had convinced herself that what they shared was born out of love, that it was different because of how much they meant to each other. But as Tyler became more distant, she began to question her judgment. She couldn't ignore the feeling that she was losing control. The fear of being discovered grew stronger each day. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Every call from her daughter, Laura, was met with a tight voice and brief answers. Laura had started to feel something was off. Her son hadn't returned her calls in weeks, and when she finally reached him, he was evasive. She decided to visit. It wasn't a planned trip, just a surprise check-in. When she arrived, she immediately sensed the strangeness in the house. Tyler looked disheveled, uncomfortable. Martha seemed anxious, her smiles forced and eyes darting. Laura didn't stay long, but the visit left her disturbed. After she left, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. A mother's instinct told her that her son was involved in something he didn't understand, and her own mother seemed to be at the center of it. That night she made a decision to call a friend in law enforcement, hoping they could help her figure out what was going on. Quietly, for now. Meanwhile, inside the Ellington house, the silence between Martha and Tyler grew louder. The guilt, the fear, the shame, they all lived in the same rooms now. There was no more pretending that everything was fine. Their connection had crossed a line, and the consequences were starting to catch up with them. Neither of them knew it yet, but the house that had once been a haven was slowly turning into a trap. Martha could feel it in the way Tyler moved. He was no longer the grateful grandson who had needed a place to stay. There was distance in his eyes, a coldness that made the small farmhouse feel unfamiliar. He barely spoke during meals and often disappeared for hours, retreating into the basement or taking long, silent walks with no explanation. Martha, who had once looked forward to their time together, now found herself anxious around him. Their secret had transformed into a silent threat, hovering over every interaction. Tyler had changed. The guilt and confusion that had once been buried beneath his need for comfort were beginning to surface in toxic ways. He blamed Martha in his mind, not openly, but in the sharpness of his tone and the way he recoiled from her touch. He felt trapped in the house, in the situation, in his own mind. The line between what was real and what was wrong blurred each day. He began drinking late at night, alone in the living room with the lights off, letting the static from the television fill the silence. He didn't want to think. He just wanted to forget. Martha tried to regain control. She suggested they talk, return to how things used to be before things went too far. But Tyler wasn't interested. He grew defensive, even angry. Her concern seemed to make things worse. The gentle tone she once used now irritated him. He would slam doors behind him, ignore her completely for hours, sometimes days. She was beginning to see a different side of him, one that frightened her. One morning, Martha discovered a broken plate in the kitchen. Tyler was nowhere to be found, and there was no note. She waited by the window for hours until he returned, his face emotionless. When she asked where he had been, he only shrugged and locked himself in his room. That night, Martha stayed awake, listening for sounds, terrified of what might happen next. Meanwhile, Laura was still uneasy. Her brief visit had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The way Tyler avoided her gaze, the strange closeness between him and Martha. It didn't sit right. She began asking questions, quietly reaching out to friends and family, trying to piece together a clearer picture. Her suspicions deepened when she learned Tyler had dropped out of therapy months earlier, despite telling her he was still attending. The story he told her about living with Martha to get back on track now seemed like a thin cover. Martha was losing sleep. She started locking her door at night, something she never had to do before. Her nerves were frayed and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She thought about calling someone, Laura, maybe, but she couldn't bring herself to explain what had happened. The shame was too great. The fear of being exposed was even greater. Tyler, on the other hand, was spiraling. The house, once a place of safety, now felt suffocating. Every room held memories he wanted to erase. He blamed Martha for letting things get this far, but deep down, he hated himself more. He had no job, no friends, and now no direction. His thoughts grew darker, more erratic. He stopped caring about consequences. The air in the house grew heavy, every movement charged with tension. No one else knew what had happened behind those walls, but inside the damage was clear. Something was unraveling, and both Martha and Tyler were powerless to stop it. The days that followed were heavy with dread. Tyler had become a shadow of himself, quiet, brooding, and unpredictable. He barely left his room during the day, emerging only at night when the rest of the world slept. Martha, still holding on to fragments of denial, tried to keep the household running like nothing had changed. She cooked meals Tyler didn't eat, cleaned rooms he never entered, and kept the curtains closed as if blocking out the sun could also block out the truth. But the walls of the farmhouse seemed to be closing in. Martha had aged in a matter of weeks. Her posture sagged, her eyes were tired, and her movements slower. She lived in constant fear. Fear of Tyler's moods, fear of discovery, fear of what might happen next. She began to realize that what she once thought was love had been something else entirely. It was need, confusion, and loneliness twisted into something monstrous. But it was too late to undo what had already been done. Tyler's emotional instability began to show in dangerous ways. He smashed a mirror in the bathroom one night, leaving shards on the floor. He shouted at nothing, pacing the halls with clenched fists and wild eyes. Martha tried to talk to him, to calm him down, but he barely looked at her anymore. His hatred was no longer hidden. It simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over. The turning point came one Sunday morning. Martha had made breakfast and set the table, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that they could sit together like they used to. Tyler walked in, took one look at the table, and knocked the plate to the floor. He didn't say a word. He just stared at her, his chest rising and falling quickly, his jaw clenched. Martha froze. She didn't move to clean it up. She didn't speak. Something in his eyes made her realize he was no longer just angry. He was dangerous. That same afternoon, Laura returned. She had not warned them she was coming. Her gut told her she had waited too long already. When she pulled into the driveway, the house looked still, too still. She knocked several times before Martha opened the door. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken. Tyler wasn't in sight. Laura stepped inside and immediately felt the weight in the air. She asked questions about Tyler, about how they were doing. but Martha could barely respond. Her answers were clipped, evasive. Laura didn't press. She stayed only a few minutes, but it was enough. When she left, she didn't go home. She went straight to the sheriff's office and filed a formal report. She didn't know exactly what was happening in that house, but she knew it wasn't safe. Back at the farmhouse, Martha stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window. Tyler was in the backyard, pacing, talking to himself. Her hands trembled. She knew it was over. Whatever they had, whatever lie she had told herself to make it feel acceptable, had collapsed. Now there was only fear. She thought about running, about packing a bag and disappearing before things got worse. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she wouldn't leave. Whether it was guilt or denial, she felt bound to the house and to Tyler. But deep down, she also knew something had shifted forever. The uneasy truce they had maintained had cracked. And what was coming next, she feared, would be far worse than anything that had come before. The final days inside the Ellington farmhouse were drenched in silence, the kind that doesn't offer peace, only the quiet before collapse. Martha barely slept. She moved through the house like a ghost, trying to avoid Tyler, who had grown darker, colder, and more volatile with each hour. The air was thick with unspoken tension. The house that had once offered refuge had become a place of dread. Every corner seemed to echo with regret. Every closed door felt like it hid a secret that was ready to burst open. Tyler no longer looked like the boy she once knew. He had become a man consumed by bitterness, his eyes hollow, his expressions distant. He rarely ate and barely spoke. His silence wasn't passive, it was sharp, heavy, full of blame. He had turned inward, allowing his anger to ferment in isolation. He resented Martha, resented himself, and resented the world that now felt permanently closed to him. On a gray morning just after dawn, Martha found Tyler standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. His hands were shaking. She asked if he was okay, her voice almost a whisper, and he turned to her with an expression she couldn't read. There was no yelling, no threats, just silence and something far more terrifying: resignation. He walked past her without a word. She stood there, frozen, unable to follow. That night, the quiet was different. It wasn't heavy with suspense. It was hollow. Martha paced the hallway, unsure what she was waiting for, but certain something was coming. The hours stretched endlessly. She eventually sat down in her armchair in the living room, too tired to move but too afraid to sleep. The clock ticked. The wind rattled the windows. Still no sound from Tyler's room. Then came the crash. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make her jump. She ran to the staircase and saw the broken picture frame at the base, one that had hung on the wall above the landing for years. But what chilled her blood wasn't it the shattered glass. It was the trail of red droplets leading toward the basement door. The next minutes were a blur of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The basement door creaked open slowly, and there she found him. Tyler slumped against the wall, blood on his shirt, a kitchen knife in his hand. His breathing was shallow, eyes glazed over, and beside him lay a folded letter addressed to whoever finds this. He had tried to end it, not out of guilt alone, but because the weight of it all had crushed him. The shame, the isolation, the unraveling of his mind, it had driven him to the edge. Martha called for help with shaking hands. Paramedics arrived quickly. Tyler was taken to the hospital, unconscious but still alive. The letter revealed everything. Tyler confessed to the relationship, to the emotional collapse, to the overwhelming guilt that had consumed him. He described the pressure of secrecy and the constant fear of being found out. Most disturbing of all, he admitted he had considered taking Martha's life before taking his own. But in the end he couldn't do it. The investigation that followed was swift and public. Martha was questioned extensively. Though she faced no criminal charges, she became a social outcast. Her family cut ties. Neighbors stopped speaking. She remained in that house alone once again. But this time her loneliness was soaked in shame and grief. Tyler survived, but was never the same. He was committed to a psychiatric facility, where he remains under long-term supervision. He speaks rarely and writes even less. But when he does, his letters are always addressed to Martha, letters that go unopened. The tragedy was complete. What began as a quiet act of comfort between two broken people spiraled into a psychological nightmare. A bond that should never have existed destroyed two lives and left scars on a family that would never fully heal. And the house at the edge of Brookhaven still stands. Silent, old, and filled with echoes of everything that went horribly, unforgivably wrong.